Greetings and salutations, young true believers. Today we're talking about Ann Phillips, Dealing with Difference, a politics of ideas or a politics of presence. So, very quickly, let's get something out of the way. What does Phillips mean when she talks about liberalism? She's not referring to what you might think. She's not talking about the difference between conservative ideals and liberal ideas in the United States and one party representing the liberal ideas, right? Rather, liberalism in this context refers to a social political arrangement that has characterized the Western world, certainly since the end of World War I, but perhaps even going back as far as the late 19th century, right? So again, it's an idea that a nation state is ideally compromised with a representative form of democratic government, a Republican form of government in which people elect their representatives, and your economic system is largely laissez-faire capitalism. That's what's meant by liberalism in this context, right? So then the question is, a politics of ideas or politics of presence, what's that dichotomy? A politics of ideas is, these are principled party positions, be they largely left or largely right, and we are going to elect candidates who are going to present these ideas to the public, right? Whereas a politics of presence is, there are constituent groups within any representative democracy, be they racial, ethnic, religious, or even indeed gendered, right? Women have been historically underrepresented, obviously. And our concern here is to make sure that our presence is felt as a group, that this marginalized group has political power, right? Because the question goes, can a black man represent a black woman adequately in a political theater? No. The thought is, a black woman has to represent her, not just her race, but also her gender, right? The question then, as Phillips sees it, right, is, well, the problem is this winds up diluting, right, the effectiveness of advancing various ideas on which everybody can agree. But nevertheless, it's a very real problem too when groups are historically underrepresented, right? Part of the problem stems from the fact that there's by no means are black women a unified voting bloc. Black women within their group have numerous debates among themselves about what it is to be a black woman, what it means to be a black woman in a representative democracy. What's it mean to be a lesbian in a representative democracy? What does it mean to be a First Nations or Native American within the larger American democracy? Again, you want to represent the politics of presence, that is to say, our people need a bit more visible profile, but we also want to advance ideas upon which we can all agree, right? So, what's the best way forward? Here on page 181, she includes a quotation from a philosopher named William Connolly. One compelling attraction of democracy, he says, is that it enables anyone to engage in fundamental riddles of existence through participation in a public politics that periodically disturbs and denaturalizes elements governing the cultural unconscious. But these same characteristics can intensify the reactive demand to re-dogmatize conventional identities if a large minority of the society is already suffering under severe burden of material deprivation and effective exclusion from the good life offered to a majority. If you want to know what the Black Lives Matter protests were about last summer, that's exactly what it was. There was a large minority who had been excluded from the political process, who had not enjoyed the fruits of American prosperity by and large, right? And wanted their seat at the table. That in turn led to a massive backlash on behalf of certain conservative groups who, frankly, were turf guarding. They didn't want to lose any of their privilege. They didn't want to see a challenge, right, to their cultural hegemony. This is exactly what Connolly was talking about. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do? What do we do? How do we strike a balance, as it were, between the politics of ideas, politics of presence? That's exactly the conundrum we find ourselves in, right? And again, Phillips wrote this in 1994, but we're still trying to flesh this out even now, right? So she writes at the top of page 185, through all these examples, the biggest mistake is to set up ideas And she's been talking about, the internal politics of groups, black women, lesbians, etc. Right? Through all these examples, the biggest mistake is to set up ideas as the opposite of political presence. To treat ideas as totally separate from the people who carry them, or worry exclusively about the people without giving a thought to their policies and ideas. Right? So Phillips' position, and I think there's something to be said for this, is to deny that there is this dichotomy between a politics of ideas, and a politics of presence. She goes on to note, it should be said, however, that this is not such a frequent mistake as the caricatures suggest, and that those exploring equal or proportionate presence rarely regard it as a substitute for the politics of competing ideas. If anything, the most acute criticisms of the politics of presence have come from those most committed to challenging political exclusion, and the debate has long shifted beyond its either-or axis, right? So skipping down a little bit, she says, what is perhaps emerging is that the more satisfactory ways of redressing group exclusion are those which are less group specific. This seems to be the case in relation to gender quotas, if only because the category of woman is so inclusive of other kinds of difference or division that it leaves open a necessary space for a multiplicity of political ideas, right? Or political identities is what she writes. So, what's the best way forward? We want more diversity. We need desperately more diversity in our political system, especially, again, if we pride ourselves on being a multicultural, diverse and effective democracy, right? But that can't come at the sacrifice of ideas. Ideas ultimately are what get politicians elected, right? And they are also ostensibly what drives forward the development of liberty in a democratic society.